Can architects help with professional burnout? Stay tuned to find out more. As Jacques-Alain Miller once joked, an evidence-based life is hard work. It requires a kind of self-audit that can challenge one's most cherished attempts at fulfillment and even one's deepest sense of non-existence. In the spirit of this joke, I'd like to take an evidence-based approach to professional burnout. And in this spirit, it's worth taking seriously a familiar narrative at current conferences and gatherings of architects. They're socially committed, they want to help people, and they want to reduce their impact on the natural world. But after the conference, dinner comes, and here the narrative changes. And it turns out that up to half the group are feeling burned out. Now, interestingly, the word professional burnout first came into prominence in popular culture in Graham Greene's 1960 novel, A Burnt Out Case, in which a world-famous architect becomes increasingly cynical and disillusioned until he finally quits. It's a familiar story in many other professions where highly skilled doctors, lawyers, or academics become disengaged from practice and averse to the workplace. Now, the dinner time narratives vary in ascribing the causes. Some mention bullying, others mention exploitative workloads or difficult, ungrateful clients. Some mention a growing self-contempt for abandoning their creativity, or the wanton commercial exploitation, effacement, or even destruction of their work. Professional burnout is characterized by a change from caring to apathy, involvement to distancing, openness to self-protection, trust to suspicion, enthusiasm to disillusionment, and self-esteem to personal devaluation. Professional burnout is not the same as workplace stress, which is an elevated state, whereas professional burnout sees a drop in energy, an emotional exhaustion, a joyless striving, and an erosion of the soul. Now, in the 2020s, particularly in the United Kingdom and the United States, where rates are the highest, professional burnout is the most important workplace mental health issue from a cost and productivity perspective. It equally affects a diverse range of professionals of all ages, ethnicities, and genders. Burnout is particularly prevalent in people-facing occupations such as nurses, physicians, social workers, clergy, and teachers. These are the people who help people, and I wonder whether architects could do more to figure out whether architecture could help with burnout, starting with themselves. After all, of all the professions, architects are the best positioned to experiment with mitigating burnout through office design, starting with their own offices. Thus, the purpose of this paper is to initiate a dialogue on how to achieve this. It starts with a brief historical review and critique of the ways architects of the workplace have used psychological theories and experiments in the past. And this is followed by a review of the literature on burnout and the architectural setting, and then a discussion of the two dominant contemporary theories for the cause and mitigation of professional burnout. And I will conclude by proposing an empirical experiment to test workplace settings that might mitigate professional burnout. So just to start then with our brief historical review of office architecture and psychology, we could say that for over a century, architects have been claiming that a well-designed workplace significantly improves a person's performance, and there's plenty of evidence to support this. However, if architects want to experiment with architectural therapies for burnout, we would best remember the historical successes and failures of past efforts to influence human minds. What emerged in architecture in the 20th century was an inconclusive debate between the dry sciences and the wet humanities and their very different understandings of the human psyche. Now, since the 1920s, architects in industrialized countries have been incorporating psychological research into office design to enhance productivity. They studied the psychological impact of overcrowding. They started locating introverts in private offices and extroverts in communal work areas. This was the era of modernist functionalism that considered the motivational effects of urban skyscrapers, electrification, and women in the office place. At the same time, practitioners of psychoanalysis, such as Freud and Jung, designed their own clinical offices with therapeutic benefits that showcased considerable collections of art. Now, starting in the 1940s and 50s, there was the recognition that modernist functionalist office design was not adequately considering human behavior or the increase of women in the office. To remedy their reputation for dehumanizing the workforce, architects played a crucial role in the formation of a new area of study called environmental psychology. And this started in the 1960s with things like the Building Performance Research Unit at Strathclyde and the Environmental Design Research Association in New York and the journal Environment and Behavior. Now, this new discipline examined how people perceived and experienced their built environment and how it influenced their behavior and well-being. In roughly chronological order, they used personality psychology, such as Eysenck's introverts and extroverts. They used Roter's notion of the locus of control and the Yerkes-Dodson law of optimal arousal. Motivational psychology was also used, such as Maslow's hierarchy of needs and Hertzberg's motivation hygiene theory. Environmental psychology worked particularly with Kurt Lewin's formula B equals FPE, where behavior is a function of the person and their environment. Meanwhile, Hall's proxemic framework looked at the four spatial zones people used for social distancing: intimate space, personal space, social space, and public space. And the psychologists Stokolos worked on differences between objective density and subjective crowding. And as the research came in, architects used the findings in office design, sometimes in their own offices. At the same time, professional burnout came into general prominence. So after 2 decades of collaboration, by the end of the 1970s, the results of environmental psychology were highly inconclusive to most architects, and were often criticized for being dry, deterministic, and naive about human motives. The office turned out not to be a giant Skinner box, able to control human behavior. As well, many experiments were not relevant to architects, and those that were often made their reports in the form of statistical probabilities, with recommendations so hedged with mights and maybes as to be quite confounding and ultimately impractical as guides for architects. Although post-occupancy surveys were invented at this time, they were infrequent and often involved many thousands of data points that architects found difficult to interpret and even harder to apply to future designs. So it could be concluded here that because architects were not really sufficiently involved in this research, its value to the design process was far less than expected. Now, through the postmodern 1980s and 1990s, architecture and environmental psychology really diverged. The psychologists increasingly turned to examine human behavior in the natural environment, and amongst architects, meanwhile, they turned to understand rather than control human behavior. They turned to the humanities, starting with existentialism and then phenomenology, while design sought to reverse the illegibility of modernist architecture and its failure to communicate. In the context particularly of the United Kingdom, all of this was led by a general interest in Merleau-Ponty and by Dalibor Vézelay at Cambridge in his use of Heidegger. The one exception at this time was a small school at the AA under Mark Cousins that turned to Freud and the semiotic theories of psychoanalysis. So by the end of this postmodern turn, ideas such as being in the world, or ego and superego and id, proved fascinating insights into the effects of architecture on human consciousness. But as it has been observed, perhaps unfairly, this wet school of architecture theory was even less influential than the dry one of the 60s and 70s. Both schools had limited influence on design at this time, as it abandoned the action farm, the action office for things like the cubicle farm, and eventually the digitally enabled office, and what was often called the Google office today. And looking at the historical rates of burnout, all through these developments in office design, burnout is going consistently up. So the 2020s have seen a new awareness of mental health issues and a tentative reconnection between architecture and psychology, most notably through the work of Corpella and Hartig on restorative places and the shared ground between sustainability and biophilia. As well, advances have been made in architectural design for neurodivergent conditions such as dementia and autism. Over in the architecture humanities, there's a concentration on moral principles of social harmony and justice, and thus the sanity of those who inhabit architectural spaces. So it is in this historical context that we might renew a research agenda that looks for the sanity that architecture might provide by leveraging the sciences and the humanities in finding solutions. Concisely then, architects have an extensive track record in designing efficient offices, sometimes by experimenting with their own spaces. So why aren't we experimenting with design in our own offices to mitigate burnout? There could be some truth in the adage, architect cure thyself, if we did not outsource our necessary research, as was done in the 60s and 70s, and instead found rigorous ways for the architecture profession to gather its own psychological evidence and investigations. Many professions are looking to reduce and prevent professional burnout by changing their built environment, but they're not able to find architects capable of making evidence-based design proposals because there really is little to no research on this. Now, it may be costly for an architect to test solutions by building their own office, yet when done rigorously at a statistically significant scale, it can be highly valid evidence-based research. Architectural offices can be more than sites for the production of design. They can also be sites for the efficient generation of expertise through research. So that brings us to the question of what evidence is there that burnout can be caused or mitigated by architecture? And what role could architects play in researching this? Well, the literature needs to be reviewed in order to propose an appropriate experiment. Now, burnout is of general interest to clinical psychologists and psychoanalysts, in part because these professions also report high rates of burnout among their own ranks. The role of the architectural setting in the causation or alleviation of burnout, though, is an open question. Among this literature, part of the problem is that the research has given a lot more attention to the causes of stress in the workplace than to mental health conditions such as professional burnout. Among the early psychological literature on burnout, there's limited attention to workplace design. The conceptualization of burnout originates in the pioneering work conducted by Freudenberger, who was a Freudian, and Maslach, who was a psychologist, who largely identified organizational and social causes of burnout and did not rate the architectural environment very highly. One of Maslach's reasons for discounting the physical workplace as a cause was that any workplace can be problematic for a person with burnout. People who are experiencing burnout begin to see everything in a negative light and report that the job conditions are poor, whether they are or not. More recent research has found that professional burnout can be antagonized or mitigated by environmental factors such as the office, in interesting research done in 2003, 2005, and 2006, so very recently. Now, when it comes to therapy for burnout, Brill has found that the environment can be crucial to recovery, concluding that burnout was an exceptionally mediated, job-related, dysphoric and dysfunctional state in an individual without major psychopathology who has, one, functioned for a time at adequate performance levels in the same job situation, and two, will not recover to previous levels without outside help or environmental rearrangement. So, among the most recent literature by Demaruti has also found that the office can be a partial cause or cure for professional burnout, but the necessary experiments have not been conducted. Demaruti here in this quote you can see is critical of Maslach and the psychologists here, basically because intervening on the symptoms doesn't remove the causes, and this is very interesting. Not only does it support my case here, but Demaruti makes the important point that the best therapeutic results for professional burnout come from individual therapy combined with redesigning the workplace, and also makes the point that therapy comes in two kinds: a psychological treatment of the symptoms and a psychoanalytic treatment of the causes. And this observation resonates, I think, very much with the historical trajectory of architecture and the mental health professions that I gave you earlier. And it would seem reasonable to me that any architectural design process would seem to divide along the same lines as the therapies. So, what is suggested at the end of this brief literature review is a test of two design processes derived from the two major schools of thought on the cause and therapy for burnout. In choosing these two therapeutic methods, this experiment inevitably restages some of the historical debates in architecture between the wet humanities and the dry sciences. Is consciousness a matter of cognition and behavior, or is it a matter of the psyche and its complex motives and experiences? Is burnout caused by entirely conscious factors, or is it caused by unconscious or preconscious factors? Whichever answer one gives, the paucity or richness of the architect's conception of human mental life is the a priori basis of their research. And the humanities, as much as the sciences, have much to offer here. So, what then are these two therapeutic methods and the architectural design processes that might support them? Now, given the above historical review, this paper proposes the formulation and testing of two design methods for the mitigation of professional burnout, one based on psychological, the other based on psychoanalytic theory. The psychological school looks at the observable behavior and aims for the cessation of symptoms across three dimensions: emotional exhaustion, depersonalization, and reduced personal accomplishment. The psychoanalytic school instead offers a model of psychodynamic stages and looks at personal history while aiming for the resolution of unconscious conflicts. Now, there are numerous studies of the relative effectiveness of these two therapeutic methods in treating mental health problems. As we probably all know, the early research showed superior results for psychological therapies such as CBT. But more recent and more robust studies and meta-analyses suggest that in-person psychoanalytic therapies achieve similar or even greater long-term outcomes for many conditions, including depression and anxiety. Numerous researchers have noticed that psychological treatments such as CBT produce results more rapidly, while psychoanalytic methods take longer but have longer-lasting effects. In the treatment of professional burnout, the effectiveness of CBT has been much more widely studied than the effectiveness of psychoanalysis. Now, one way to illustrate the difference between these two therapeutic methods might be the case of Graham Greene's Burnt Out Architect. But I'd like to give you a somewhat less fictional case of an architect who reported a burnout due to a constant, exhausting anxiety from having his office next to his incompatible boss. Constant micromanagement led him to become bitter and cynical about his role. And the psychological school suggested mindfulness exercises combined with moving his office. A psychologically minded architect suggested creating a staff room in a courtyard where he could retreat during breaks. When this was tried, it did not work for long, and his anxiety continued wherever he worked on the office floor. Then he discovered something new. Even when his incompatible boss changed and he got a new one, his symptoms remained. And so he turned to the psychoanalytic school. This therapy uncovered an unconscious anxiety around authority figures stemming from a fractious relationship with a father who set unreasonably high standards for his children. A psychoanalytic-minded architect sent him to his photo album looking for an image of him with his father in an affectionate situation, and then hung an enlargement of it on the wall in his office in a symmetrical relation to a window. And as his therapy developed, AI generation was used to generate additional images, one of which was based on a memory of a past event in his life when he very much rebelled against his father. Furthermore, a mason was employed to carve certain significant words into the stonework to help him adjust his expectations and interactions. Out of all of this, his burnout score improved, yet it remained unclear which of these therapies had helped and how. So let me more fully review these two therapeutic methods and their concordant architectural therapies. Psychological therapies for burnout often look at how people develop thoughts and expectations about themselves, others, and the world. It looks for thought patterns, and where these thoughts are functional, they contribute to happiness and the ability to adapt to changing circumstances. Dysfunctional thoughts are rigid and non-adaptive and contribute to stress, emotional problems, and destructive behavior patterns. In burnout patients, this may express itself in narratives of perfectionism, conflict avoidance, sub-assertiveness, the idea of always having to prove oneself, or an excessive sense of duty. Cognitive behavioral therapy is used to change the dysfunctional thought patterns and learn new social skills. Therapy may run between 3 and 10 sessions. And amongst this therapy, I do not include meditation, mindfulness, yoga, group therapy, or psychopharmacology such as SSRIs. Now, a psychological architectural therapy this office design process might proceed by identifying the architectural variables that are contributing to burnout and manipulate them to improve behavior. The architect might look for the spatial aspects of Maslow's 6 causes of professional burnout: chronically difficult job demands, high demands and low resources, conflict between people, role demands and values, lack of social support, lack of job autonomy, and poor mentoring and supervision. Design solutions might include specific spaces then for difficult jobs to make them more intermittent, greater or more adequate resources, lower levels of conflict, higher levels of social support, and so on. Other types of psychological therapy include restorative places, immersive or flow activities that wholly occupy consciousness and provide a break from work behavior. This is why the Google office has ping pong tables, as well as biophilic environments. At a more challenging level, the architect could also perhaps help the client avoid dysfunctional thoughts and choose functional thought patterns. Now, the psychoanalytic method is different. It's generally alert to a veiled dehumanization in the psychological method. It works on the premise that those with professional burnout are not faulty brains with dysfunctional thoughts, but desiring subjects. However, as Van Huel and Verhagen observe, it's been slower in offering treatment. The psychological study of burnout has mainly been restricted to organizational and social psychology and has been quantitative in nature. Consequently, only limited insight into burnout dynamics and the personal meanings associated with professional burnout has been developed. Research based on a qualitative approach and conceptually driven studies, such as psychoanalysis, can potentially overcome this deficiency. But, as they point out, such studies have remained relatively scarce in number. So psychoanalysis does not rely on pre-formulated questions and pre-written descriptions of symptoms, as Maslach's Burnout Index does. It tries to listen to the patient's spontaneous complaints. Psychological surveys and questionnaires may fail to uncover the accumulation of allusions to the embarrassing conflicts that are secretly ruining a person's life. Psychoanalysis would claim that professional burnout constitutes a language of distress that cannot be understood without careful listening. In this theoretical view, Maslach is correct in that the cause of professional burnout is that something is missing, but it's not missing fairness or community, etc. What is missing is closer to a lack of being. Now, among the range of psychoanalytic methods, there's less literature on burnout, but it includes the Jungians, psychoanalytic existentialists, and the Lacanians. And the Lacanian school, of course, makes useful distinctions between mental agencies such as the ego, and ego-ideal, and the superego. And its Freudian orientation thus means that it easily integrates with other methodological discussions about burnout among psychoanalysts. Now, according to Van Hul and Verhaeghe, professional burnout develops in 3 stages that, once identified, can help focus the therapy. In the first stage, there's a tension between the ego and the ideal ego and an overfunctioning, painful overfunctioning of the superego. The narratives in this first stage are about exhausting exertions, a strong sense of duty, feeling that what they're doing is never good enough, self-blame, and difficulties in drawing boundaries between work and private life. All those in that stage, raise your hand. In the second stage, there's an invalidation of the ego, invalidation of the ego ideal, a growing identity confusion about self and the big other, and a growing sense that the big other is enjoying their decline. Narratives are about ways that the other has devastated something, or the other is threatening, so on and so forth. In the third or final, worst stage, at this point, individuals stop entirely comparing their ego to their ideal ego in the job context. This leads to a deterioration in performance, a withdrawal from interaction, and conflict, a growing ambivalence, and an impoverishment of speech. Lacanian therapy concentrates on the subjective function that work has in relation to the subject and the big other. It specifically focuses on the core symbolic elements the person uses to relate on the job and with others. Unraveling and working through the symbolic structure puts imaginary preoccupations of living up to an ideal ego into perspective. This enables subjects to break the repetitions they are involved in and make new choices in relation to their own efforts and the issue of being recognized by others. A psychoanalytic architectural design process would aim to produce an environment that helps a particular person to change their style of interaction and the specific symbolic elements in their discourse. It might start, for example, by identifying the stages of burnout. And Van Hul and Verhaeghe suggest that first stage intervention should focus not on the burnout complaints as such, but on the position a person repeatedly takes in relation to others through his or her job. In the second dynamic process, an experience of loss at the level of psychic investment is pivotal. Positive and negative memories and expectations pertaining to the invalidated ego ideal will have to be remembered such that disinvestment from them is possible. In the third dynamic process, interventions will focus on the tendency to flee situations that evoke ambivalence. Well, having laid out these two schools of thought about professional burnout and their methodologies, it's now possible to sketch out something of an experiment where the dependent variable is professional burnout and the independent variables are psychological therapy. Oh, I've got a slide on this. Psychological therapy plus psychological office design, and 2, psychoanalytic therapy plus psychoanalytic office design. What is being tested is the effect of therapy on its own compared to therapy plus an informed change in the workplace environment. Now, conducting this experiment requires a standard measure of burnout, which is always going to be a fuzzy concept. And I suggest here the use of the Maslach burnout inventory, which is by far the most commonly used in this field of research. It's self-administered and takes about 10 minutes to complete. There are questions like, I feel emotionally drained from my work. I feel fatigued when I get up in the morning and have to face another day. On the job, I feel like I'm at the end of my rope, and so on. It asks about depersonalization, and how much they care about the people they work with. Now, this index has many limitations, and there are other measures, such as the Empowerment for Participation Assessment Battery. But, as I said, the MBI inventory would allow cross-comparison with past experiments, as it is the most frequently used measure. Other measures would include things like sick leave rates and interviews. So the idea would be to identify a group of architects with professional burnout. I've had no difficulty with this at all, working with some of the major professional weekly medias for architects. They're very much aware of this. We could identify these candidates by asking them to take the Maslach burnout test. And once we had a group of volunteers, they could be randomly divided into 3 subsets. G1 psychology, G2 psychoanalysis, G3 is a control group. And at this point, we would also need to assess dependent variables, such as comorbidities. Secondly, we would need to recruit therapists, preferably ones that are local to the architects. One group of psychological therapists, one group of psychoanalytic therapists. They would be matched randomly with some tilt towards geographic proximity to promote in-person therapy, and if necessary, to allow the therapist to visit the work premise. The first sequence would begin with the group of architects with burnout attending their assigned therapies. G3 would only attend therapy, and all the therapists and architects would, of course, keep a journal, and during the therapies would be in conversation with their therapists obviously about burnout, but also in active discussions about new workplace designs. Architectural therapy might include a range of possibilities: the office location, size, arrangement, number of people, doors, windows, interior. It could look at wider organizational spatial restructuring. It could look at working from home. Architectural interventions might also address organizational and social issues by architectural means, although this is a bit of a tricky question. We'll come back to that. At the end of the therapy, the architects would make an office design presentation to the therapist, followed by feedback until some kind of construction design was agreed. That would lead to stage 2, the construction of the designs that could be implemented at any point during or after therapy. Some of them might be experimental and possibly temporary, with further cumulative attempts. G1 in CBT would probably run over only about 1 to 3 months, whereas the psychoanalytic group would probably need to run for up to a year. given the different time durations of the two therapies. Then we would, after the necessary time was passed, we could have a test at 1 year and I think another test at 2 years. And the efficacy of the solutions could be assessed through interviews, sick leave rates, changes in the MBI score. And also the therapists would be included in a collective effort to interpret the results. Now, in interpreting the results, it's important that this experiment qualify as a randomized controlled trial using comparable groups to reduce bias and establish a cause and effect relationship between the intervention and the outcome. As the control group G3 provides its own index of therapy-only results, but without its own independent control group of architects who receive no therapy. The experiment would benefit from benchmarks for the effectiveness of each therapy on its own in the treatment of burnout. And to assist this, we have other considerable meta-analyses of burnout therapies which could be used. Okay, then the test group would begin to allow some kinds of conclusions to questions such as, did architectural therapy improve the results of therapy only, and by how much? Which of the two combined therapeutic methods was most effective, and which was improved most by architectural therapy? The test at 2 years would give insight in how the augmentation of therapy with architectural therapy prolonged the beneficiary period. Now, one of the most important limitations that I identified in the historical review was the gap between the findings of psychological experiments and the architects who tried to work with them. As Philip points out, supporting evidence was given in terms of statistical techniques that were difficult to interpret, much less implement. In these historical collaborations, the model was one in which the psychologists gave data to the architects. And I think in critiquing this experiment, one of the things that I wanted to point out is that the way we've done it in the past did not help the emergence of architectural professionals capable of providing successful design solutions. And this experiment offers a different model where architects participate directly in the experiments and are themselves the data. However, we do have some limitations. This experiment, I think, could be critiqued for its management of unmeasured dependent variables, including workload and organization. Mazak, for example, found that individual psychological strategies for reducing burnout were ineffective unless combined with organizational changes that removed major stressors. And this experiment doesn't really look for that, at least not immediately. And also, what is a organizational factor? I think psychologists and psychoanalysts would have their own definitions of what constituted an organizational factor. And really, I think the most successful outcomes in this experiment will identify the architects who can best figure out how to alleviate professional burnout in their offices, but it will be difficult to identify the role played by the therapist and the architect. And I wonder whether this experiment would in fact end up producing unique one-off teams of therapist and architect that may be especially capable of designing offices for other people. And so this experiment could produce a long-lasting expertise within the profession. Both G1 and G2 groups would have personal experience with burnout therapy and a design process that was tested by direct experience and verified by metrics. Although the experiment may not lead directly to the formation of design guidelines in the manner that we have, say, for dementia or ADHD, it would lend itself to an illustrated top 10 collection, perhaps, of best practices. And this kind of documentation could be of enormous value to the profession in ways that previous experiments have not. And I suppose, just to conclude here, in the worst case, where architectural interventions prove entirely unsuccessful in enhancing the benefit of therapy on its own, the experiment will at least have the benefit of making us much more aware of burnout in the profession and provide much needed high-quality evidence for what architects can and cannot achieve in collaboration with the mental health professions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tim. Questions and comments?